Bugungi darsimizda Cambridge 13 test 4 section 4 analizini ko'rib chiqamiz. Birinchi navbatda savollarni o'qigan holda bizdan nima kutilayotganligini tushunib olishimiz kerak bo'ladi. O'z ko'rgandek section 4 questions 31 to 40 one word only. Undan keyin boshlaymiz. The history of coffee. Demak, coffee tarixi. 1623-yil in Constantinople the ruler ordered the of every coffee house. The something of every coffee. Har bitta coffee house nimanidir yoki nimadir qilinishini order qilgan, buyruq bergan. Demak, bu qismda yoki harakatnoma bo'ladi yoki qanaqadir jism bo'ladi. Order something. Harakatnoma bo'ladi. Nimadir harakatni buyurish mumkin bo'ladi bu qismda. Shuning uchun ham bu qismda qanaqadir action bo'ladi, situation bo'ladi. Coffee shops were compared to nimagadir compare qilingan Yevropada 17-asrda o'zini ko'rganingdek bozorga sravnez qilish mumkin, nimaga sravnez qilish mumkin? Shunaqa joylarga joy bo'ladi bu qism. 32 the name of the place bo'ladi. Xo'p, birinchi navbatda nima qilish kerak? Bu qismda o'zing ko'rganingdek headline-larga, kichkina headline-cha, sub headline-chalarga e'tibor beringlar. Coffee in the Arab world, coffee arrives to Europe, coffee in European colonization, coffee in 19th century degan narsalarni e'tibor bersanglar, agar masalan tasavvur qiling 33-savolni o'tkazib yuborsangiz, coffee in European colonization boshlanishidan oldin 2 sekund, 3 sekund pauza qilishadi va undan keyin boshlashganda siz muammosiz savollarga javoblarni topish ehtimoli katta bo'ladi, imkoniyatga ega bo'lasiz. Compared to something, place bo'ladi bu. Katta ehtimolliklar. I'm sorry. Chunki coffee shop and place. They played an important part in social and something changes. Demak, o'qishda sotsial va qanaqadir o'zgarishlarda katta rol o'ynagan ekan. Sotsial bilan birgalikda endi noun bo'ladi endi o'qishda. Adjective bo'ladi. Social and religious changes. Social and personal changes. Social and beautiful changes. Ana shunaqa narsalar bo'ladi. Sifat bo'ladi. Hop, coffee in European colonization. Types of coffee were often named according to they came from. Qayoqdadir nimagadir asosan nomlangan. They came from. Qayoqdan kelishi mumkin? Place bo'lishi mumkin bu yerda. Place qanaqadir joy bo'ladi bu qismda. O'sha joy nomidan nomlangan. Brazil and Caribbean most cultivation depended on something. Bu ing bo'lishi mumkin, noun bo'lishi mumkin. Nimadandir kultivatsiya nimagadir bog'liq bo'lgan, nimadandir qaram bo'lgan, nimagadir qaram bo'lgan. In Java, coffee was used as a form of. Javada nimadir sifatida ishlatilgan ekan coffee. Ko'ramiz. Coffee became almost as important as teng miqdorda muhim bo'lib qoldi coffee. As important as gold, as important as nima bo'lishi mumkin, yana qanaqadir produkt bo'lishi mumkin-da. Bread, water, shunaqa narsa. The move towards the consumption of in Britain didn't also take place in the USA. Demak, Britaniyada move towards, ya'ni harakat bo'lgan ekan, shu bir produktni aniqlashiga, потребление qilinishiga USAda bo'lmagan ekan shunaqa narsa. Prices dropped because of improvements in something. Nimadadir bo'lgan o'zgarishlarning hisobiga, o'zgarishlar sababli narxlar tushib ketgan ekan. Industrial workers found coffee helps them to work at. Industrial workerlar, demak, ishchilar, qayerda ishlaydigan ishchilar. Endi industrial workerlar, endi fabrikada ishlaydigan, factorylarda ishlaydigan ishchilar qachondir yoki qayerdadir ishlashga at bo'lganiga yotda time bo'lsa kerak. Qayerdadir qachondir ishlashga yordam berganligini topishi mumkin, ko'rgan ekan. Ko'ramiz. Boshlaymiz.
31 to 40.
We think he was first drunk in the Arab world, but there's hardly any documentary evidence of it before the 1500s. Although, of course, that doesn't mean that people didn't know about it before then. However, there is evidence that coffee was originally gathered from bushes growing wild in Ethiopia, in the northeast of Africa. In the early 16th century, it was being bought by traders, and gradually its use as a drink spread throughout the Middle East. It's also known that in 1522, in the Turkish city of Constantinople, which was the center of the Ottoman Empire, the court physician approved its use as a medicine. By the mid-1500s, coffee bushes were being cultivated in the Yemen, and for the next 100 years, this region produced most of the coffee drunk in Africa and the Arab world. What's particularly interesting about coffee is its effect on social life. It was rarely drunk at home, but instead, people went to coffee houses to drink it. These people, usually men, would meet to drink coffee and chat about issues of the day. But at the time, this chance to share ideas and opinions was seen as something that was potentially dangerous. And in 1623, the ruler of Constantinople demanded the destruction of all the coffee houses in the city.
Destruction of all the coffee houses in the city. Buzib tashlashini buyurgan ekan. Destruction. Qanaqadir action dedik? Action bo'ldi. 63 in 1623 Constantinople ruler ordered the destruction of every coffee house. Also nimadir deb tashladi, lekin kerak emas bizga also. Ko'p gapirib tashladi. Qaranglar, shuncha odam shuncha gapirib tashladi, birinchi savolga javob kelgancha. Qayoqdasan birinchi? Oy. Mana. Hope sharing ideas, opinion, something potential dangerous bo'lgan. O'sha 23-yilda ruler demand qilgan, destruct qilib tashlashni, destructionni demand qilgan, shuning uchun ham javob destruction bo'ladi.
Though after his death, many new ones opened and coffee consumption continued. In the 17th century, coffee drinking spread to Europe, and here too, coffee shops became places where ordinary people, nearly always men, could meet to exchange ideas. Because of this, some people said that these places performed a similar function to universities.
Similar function degan o'tda compared to synonymi university bo'ladi. University compare qilingan. Universities. They were compared to universities. When a coffee drinking spread, here two coffee shops became places where ordinary people, nearly always men, could meet to exchange ideas. Because of this, some people said these places performed the similar function compared to a synonym, a university shop.
The opportunity they provided for people to meet together outside their own homes and to discuss the topics of the day had an enormous impact on social life, and many social movements and political developments had their origins in coffee house discussion.
Social movements and political developments bo'ladi, social and political changes bo'ladi, development change synonym. Political have their own origins in coffee houses dedim, nimadir debdi. Mana enormous social life, many social movements and political developments have their origins in coffee house discussions. Shuning uchun ham javob political bo'ladi. O'zlaring ko'rgandek katta pauza bo'ldi. Coffee and European colonization. Tasavvur qiling, 33 savolni o'tkazib yubordingiz, bilmay qoldingiz, o'tib ketib qoldi. Voy, o'tirsiz, voy, endi nima qilaman, qayoqdan bilaman, 34 kelishini. O'zlaring ko'rgandek, har bitta paragraf boshlashdan oldin, o'sha sabqatlarni boshlashdan oldin Coffee and European colonization haqida gapirishdan oldin 3 sekundlik, 4 sekundlik, 5 sekundgacha pauza oladi. O'sha pauzaga e'tibor beradigan bo'lsanglar, imkoniyatlaring kattaroq ball olish ehtimolling oshadi. Juda ham ko'p oshadi. O'shanga e'tibor berasizlar.
In the late 1600s, the Yemeni monopoly on coffee production broke down, and coffee production started to spread around the world, helped by European colonization. Europeans set up coffee plantations in Indonesia and the Caribbean, and production of coffee in the colonies skyrocketed. Different types of coffee were produced in different areas, and it's interesting that the names given to these different types, like mocha or Java coffee, were often taken from the port they were shipped to Europe from.
Taken from the port, they shipped to Europe from. Say shipped to Europe from, they port bo'ladi. Port. They shipped to Europe from. No, shipped to Europe from the job port bo'ladi. And it's interesting that the names given to these different types, like mocha, Java coffee, were often taken from the port. They were shipped to Europe from job bo'ladi, port bo'ladi job.
But if you look at the labor system in the different colonies, there were some significant differences. In Brazil and the various Caribbean colonies, Coffee was grown in huge plantations, and the workers there were almost all slaves. But this wasn't the same in all colonies.
Depend on slaves bo'ladimi? Plantation dedi. Slaves bo'ladi javob. Slaves. Xo'p, ikkita javobim bor. Slaves dedi, plantation dedi. Plantation dedi. Lekin men javobim slaves bo'ladi. Men slaves degan javobni o'zimga to'g'ri deb olishga qaror qilaman. Ko'ramiz. Mana. In Brazil and in various Caribbean there was grown in huge plantations and the workers were all almost slaves. Slaves. Slavelarga aloqador bo'lgan, bog'liq bo'lgan slavelar ishlamasa, uxlaydi u ham.
Example in Java, which had been colonized by the Dutch, the peasants grew coffee and passed a proportion of this on to the Dutch, so it was used as a means of taxation.
As a form of means of taxation. Taxation ya'ni soliq solish, soliqqa tortish sifatida ishlatilgan taxation bo'ladi javob. O'zing ko'rganingdek bu soliq sifatida ishlatilgan ekan. A means of degan form of synonym. Hop, which had been colonized by the Dutch. The peasant grew coffee and passed a proportion of this to the Dutch, so it was used as a means of taxation. Means of degani type of synonym, form of synonym bo'ladi o'zimda.
But whatever system was used, under the European powers of the 18th century, coffee production was very closely linked to colonization. Coffee was grown in ever-increasing quantities to satisfy the growing demand from Europe, and it became nearly as important as sugar production, which was
nearly as important, almost a synonym, nearly almost synonym as important as the sugar production edi. Shakardek, voy, shurak emas, sugar. Shakardek muhim bo'lib ketgan ekan, ahamiyati shunga ko'tarib ketgan ekan. Coffee was grown in ever-increasing quantities to satisfy the growing demand from Europe. It became nearly as important as sugar bo'ladi javob. Nearly or almost synonym, as important as struktura turibdi o'zi. Sugar production, qisqasi javob sugar.
Grown under very similar conditions. However, coffee prices were not yet low enough for people to drink it regularly at home. So most coffee consumption still took place in public coffee houses, and it still remained something of a luxury item. In Britain, however, a new drink was introduced from China and started to become popular, gradually taking over from coffee. Although at first it was so expensive that only the upper classes could afford it. This was tea.
This was tea dedi. Teaser berdi. Shunaqa bo'ldi. O'tib ketib qoldi odamlar tea dedi. Qisqasi oldin upper class ichgan dedi. This was a tea dedi. O'qiysiz.
Hundreds, it was being widely drunk. However, when the USA gained independence from Britain in 1776, they identified this drink with Britain, and coffee remained the preferred drink in the USA as
o'zing ko'rganingdek independence Amerika independence bo'lgandan keyin bu britishlarni produkti biz british yomon ko'radi endi masalan bo'ldi ichmaymiz biz tea ichmaymiz degan kofe mashhur bo'lib qolavergan tea bo'ladi javob. Qisqasi mana this was a tea da. Hop job tea bo'ladi mana qani. Luxury item in Britain when new drink was introduced. A new drink was introduced. It started to become popular, gradually taking over the coffee. Also, it's expensive that only upper class could. This was a tea job. Yes.
It still is today. So, by the early 19th century, coffee was already being widely produced and consumed. But during this century, production boomed, and coffee prices started to fall. This was partly because new types of transportation had been developed.
New types of transportation have been developed. Demak, improvements in transportation bo'ladi. Transportationdagi o'zgarishlar, yaxshilanishlar sababli barga topib ketgan ekan ular. Transportation. Qo'lamiz. Mana qisqasi mana this partly was mana this was partly because of the new types of transportation developed the improvements.
Which were cheaper and more efficient.
Yeah.
So now, working people could afford to buy coffee. It wasn't just a drink for the middle classes. And this was at a time when large parts of Europe were starting to work in industries. And sometimes this meant their work didn't stop when it got dark. they might have to continue throughout the night. So the use of coffee as a stimulant became important. It wasn't just a drink people drank in the morning for breakfast. There were also
o'zlaring ko'rganlaringdek bu qismda stimulant sifatida ishlatilgan ekan. Nightda ham dark bo'lsa ham ushlab ketavergan, o'shanga yordam bergan. Sometimes it's meant that their work didn't stop when it got dark, they might have continued throughout the night. Kechqurun bilan ishlashni davom ettirgan. Bu stimulant sifatida ishlatilganiga stimulant uyg'otadi, bir narsalar qiladi. O'sha yordam bergan. Shu bilan bugungi darsimiz o'z nihoyasiga yetadi. Hamma savollarga javob berishga harakat qildik. Muammolar bo'ladigan bo'lsa kommentlarda qoldiringlar. Eng muhimi voqea yodlasanglar, butun ideyani tushunishga harakat qilsanglar muammo bo'lmaydi. Sizlar bilan keyingi darsda ko'rishguncha xayr.